we're very happy to welcome Barbara Moore. I tease her that she knows everybody, and actually doesn't seem to be far from the truth. She is an art historian and writer specializing in the avant-garde art of the 60s, 70s, and 80s here in New York and elsewhere. For over 50 years, she's managed the vast Peter Moore photographic archive of performance art and its antecedents, and is in the midst of authoring a book on same, Observing the Avant-Garde, Peter Moore and the Photography of Performance. Please welcome Barbara Moore.
Thank you, Jay. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Okay. In the early 1960s, I was lucky enough to fall in with a circle of artists that became known as Fluxus, and to work with two of its most influential and also outspoken members, George Maciunas, who's pictured here, and Dick Higgins. These are Peter Moore photographs, of course. And Dick Higgins, whose then contentious relationship with Maciunas led him to start a rival operation, Something Else Press, the very name positing an alternative. Maciunas and Higgins were two very strong personalities who both paradoxically engaged in art and tended to diminish the role of the artist's ego. Instead of expensive, exclusive, unique, and signed works, artists would create unautographed, open-ended editions of objects or printed matter, art available to all at a reasonable price. Their subsequent divergent but overlapping publishing paths to a certain extent reflected their dramatically different backgrounds. Maciunas, a native Lithuanian, had spent some time in a displaced persons camp after World War II before emigrating to the United States. In collaboration with the musician and philosopher Henry Flint, he was stridently Marxist. His approach to producing art editions was thrifty and cunning. Unlike Fluxus performances, in which collectivity is often evident, the Fluxus publishing program would not have existed had he not been in charge. He interpreted, tweaked, and filtered other artists' work, his style tying together a fluid, amorphous group of individuals. Although stylistically his own hand is visible in every multiple Fluxus produced, his name was subsumed into a collective ideal. And, of course, these are many of the labels that he designed for Fluxus editions. Higgins was the son of wealthy parents, grandson of an industrialist who founded Worcester Press Steel. His grandfather, John Woodman Higgins, also created a private museum, the Higgins Armory Museum in Worcester, Mass. And by the way, by coincidence, that museum, after over 80 years, has just closed at the end of 2013. But most of its collection has gone to the Worcester Art Museum. Dick began Something Else in a commercial office building in what is now called the Flatiron District, and spared no expense in publishing Something Else books. Maciunas and Higgins' relationship started out compatibly enough during early collective aspirations in the formation of Fluxus, at which time Higgins submitted his double manuscript, Postface, Jefferson's Birthday, which is pictured here. It was bound what's called dos-a-do binding when the two books are back-to-back like this. And Higgins submitted this to Maciunas for publishing. As the story is most often told, their split seems straightforward and based on a seemingly trivial incident. Maciunas dilly-dallied in producing the book, so Higgins retrieved his manuscript. There was only one original and perhaps a carbon in those days, vowing to publish it himself and thereby start his own venture. As related by Peter Frank, and I just want to show you this the other way around, okay. As related by Peter Frank in his 1983 Something Else Press bibliography, quote, Higgins returned home and announced to his wife, Allison Knowles, that he was starting his own press. Really? What's it called? She asked. Shirt Sleeves Press. That's no good, came the response. Call it something else. And actually, there's another, less guarded version of the origin of the press's name. In an unpublished letter written several years later, where that would be in 1966, to Jeff Berner, Higgins revealed that what he actually proposed to Knowles was Fluxus Annex, and that Knowles persuaded him not to, quote, hurt my old comrade, unquote. Although he took her advice, Higgins's competitive attitude was openly apparent when, in spring 1964, he set up his own series of performance lectures, some conflictingly scheduled on the same dates at the same times as concerts in the famous inaugural Fluxus series at Maciunas' loft on Canal Street. I should mention at this point my own awareness, or lack of it back then. I've been struck by certain conjunctions of events that were not fully apparent to me at the time they took place. Beginning in 1964, having been drawn into the Fluxus circle, but not being an artist myself, I took every chance to work for and with Maciunas in other capacities. At that time of developing frictions, he even chose to award me a spurious title, temporary administrative director, to deflect attention from himself. In late January 1965, he wrote me from Arizona, where he had gone for his asthma. You are in charge of Fluxus public relations. Much must be repaired after my public relations effort. End quote. In the meantime, Higgins had approached me in late 1964 about becoming editor for a new press he was starting. In early January 1965, he called to say he was opening an office. I soon learned that his office equipment included an IBM executive typewriter with the same distinctive sans serif font as that used by Maciunas for Fluxus publications. So here are some pages. I know they're not sharp, but it doesn't matter. You can see the type of type there is from the typewriter. And this is a Maciunas publication. I could have chosen any one because they all had the same typeface. Only weeks later did I realize Dick had already published Postface Jefferson's Birthday using this typeface, and it wasn't until many years later that I learned he'd already considered and rejected the name Fluxus Annex. Was his job offer to me intended as a kind of executive raid on a rival press? While employed by Higgins, I continued to work often on Fluxus with Maciunas, but managed to stay aloof from the skirmishes between them, in large part due to my ignorance of many details. I was not alone in dealing with such strong personalities. Because of my own tightrope walk between Maciunas and Higgins, I can't help but empathize with Thomas Schmidt's similar relationship to Maciunas and the German Fluxus artist and graphic designer Wolf Vostell that Thomas described to me in a letter in 1983. The relation between George and Vostell was complicated. In the beginning, there was collaboration. Vostell was in the early Fluxus publications and performances. Vostell put Fluxus people into his early magazines and performances. Then came the time that Vostell tried to promote his décollage, and this is the series of décollage magazines that he made. That Vostell tried to promote his décollage as a rival form to Fluxus. And now, and that's Thomas speaking in 1983, now, seeing that Fluxus is very famous and décollage is not, Vostell even uses the term Fluxus again for many of his activities. Schmidt continues, Vostell's problem with me was, I think, that he thought me to be his scholar and was hurt and angry when I worked with George. My problem with Vostell was simply that I worked for him. I mean, I was very young and small, and Vostell was the only one I knew in Cologne who had contacts to the international avant-garde. And that actually was a very important thing for me in working for both Dick and George. Although we were in the same age range, they were so far ahead of me in knowing about the things that were going on in Europe, and particularly at Something Else Press. Just to go into the storeroom was my whole education, really, in concrete poetry and a lot of the other things, because Dick was also, in addition to his own books, he was distributing books for other publishers from Europe, Hans-Jörg Meyer and Editions Matt Moe and some of the others. And this is getting back to Thomas Schmidt's letter. He was the only one I knew in Cologne who had contacts to the international avant-garde, and he put me into his performances and magazines. And of course, I liked that very much. Maybe this was a mistake. In those young days, I found it completely all right to work with both of them, even though I always knew that I took George, or at least Fluxus, much more serious than Vostell and his activities. Maybe so the two of them both saw me as a sort of wanderer between the fronts, and maybe I was naive enough not to notice this. And that's the end of Thomas's statement. In all fairness to Higgins, he was far from the only one in conflict with Maciunas. Many early supporters of the events that had coalesced in 1962 under the title Fluxus had begun to disparage Maciunas's methods and motives. As early as April 1963, while Maciunas was still in Germany tying up loose ends from the seminal European concert series, he issued a proposed propaganda action for November Fluxus in New York City. Included were suggestions for, quote, pickets and demonstrations, sabotage and disruption of transportation system, communications system, museums, theaters, galleries. And he also wanted to stage vehicle breakdowns in traffic, and also quoting from that sort of a manifesto, clogging up subway cars during rush hours with cumbersome objects. He was going to hand out altered copies of the New York Times and Daily News and explode smell and sneeze bombs in concert halls. These provocations caused an uproar. In reply, Jackson McLowe suggested more straightforwardly political, though less inventive, targets and methods, such as, quote, support of strikers and locked-out workers, walks for peace, denunciation and agitation against war in Vietnam, U.S. aggression towards Cuba, nuclear testing, racial segregation and discrimination. In general, said McLowe, association with positive social action and activities, never with antisocial, terroristic activities and sabotage. Maciunas backtracked somewhat, claiming he'd been misunderstood and that his ideas were only suggestions meant to stimulate debate, which of course they did. He went so far as to add, without irony, a new proposal from Henry Flint, in which the final event in the New York Festival would be a lecture by Flint in the largest hall before the, quote, largest audience, denouncing all Fluxus festival activities as decadent, serious culture, end quote. Another art world attitude was expressed by Alan Capro. Capro had been invited to contribute work to Fluxus and had participated in the related New York, New Jersey Yam Festival, organized by George Brecht and Robert Watts in May 1963. But he became disenchanted with Maciunas's tactics. The June 1964 issue of the Fluxus newspaper printed a statement that Capro had made on a radio program. This is it. The group, with few exceptions, that associates itself with Fluxus is irresponsible. It is my impression that many people just simply goof off and pretend in a kind of very, very nasty way that they have certain superiority in their seemingly indifferent little activities. Its effect is to say to me and others, you guys are doing important things, but look, we are even more important doing unimportant things. End quote. Later that same year, we're now in September 1964, Capro directed Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's Originale, an elaborate multimedia event that was part of Charlotte Moorman's second annual New York Avant-Garde Festival. The all-star cast of what were then still underground performers included Higgins, Io, and Namjoon Paik, artists whom Maciunas considered part of the Fluxus galaxy. To make matters worse, Maciunas joined with Henry Flint in picketing the performances on grounds of cultural imperialism, a political stance far ahead of its time, but under the circumstances extremely unpopular. In panicked, paranoid reaction to mounting criticism, the Higgins imbroglio and what he saw as a less than full commitment to Fluxus on the part of other artists, Maciunas published a strident set of restrictions concerning use of the term Fluxus in publications and performances. If Fluxus compositions outnumber or exceed in duration other non-Fluxus compositions, the whole concert must be called and advertised as Flux Concert, he demanded. He threatened penalty fees and legal action if his conditions weren't met. These terms only fostered increasing general hostility. In mid-January 1965, shortly before Something Else Press officially opened its doors, a dispirited Maciunas went to Arizona for his asthma, his going-away party at Takako Saito's loft, attended by only a handful of Japanese, the Fluxus artist Joe Jones, my husband Peter Moore, and myself. Speculating that Fluxus wouldn't survive, he talked of moving west permanently, although in the end he was so homesick that he returned to Canal Street within a few weeks. But what was by then a running competition between himself and Higgins continued, with varying degrees of acrimony for several years. In a correspondence showing at times surprising professional civility, the two publishers accused each other of real and imagined slights. Higgins expressed annoyance that Maciunas didn't include his work in the Fluxus fold-out that was in Tulane Drama Review, and this is a picture of that, in late 1965. A few months later, Maciunas complained that Higgins left out any mention of Fluxus in his Something Else newsletter essay, Games of Art. And of course, here you're beginning to see perhaps, the two different styles that these people produced, but I'm going to get into that more later. Higgins also ignored Maciunas in most of his other newsletter essays throughout the 1960s, or referred to him obliquely without mentioning his name. In one 1968 newsletter, he spoke of Fluxus in the past tense. Quote, today, of course, it's mainly the name of a very interesting publisher of editions of art objects run by one of the founders, end quote. The two men even vied to produce the same publications, such as Daniel Sperry's Encyclopedia, which is EGG Cyclopedia, it was about eggs, and a cookbook I was compiling. This leads us back to Postface. The 1963-64 essay that comprised a large part of Something Else Press's first book. This volume originally existed in a print run of only 1,200 copies, and by the late 1970s was out of print. Higgins' Postface essay, containing the first full account in English of the legendary series of European concerts that marked the beginning of Fluxus in 1962 to 63, written by a founder of the movement and participant in the activities described, long remained a paradigm for what Fluxus had been, and thus a highly desirable research source if one could find it. In this period before Fluxus became factionalized, Higgins was exuberantly partisan on behalf of his colleagues as alternatives to what he called the going thing. Towards the end of Postface, Higgins gives an opinionated but otherwise straightforward first-person description of events leading from his own presence in John Cage's influential New School class of the late 1950s through his participation in the European Fluxus concerts. He relates, quote, "In 1961, George Maciunas turned up. He wound up presenting the most interesting performances I have ever heard of, and he has never stopped." Higgins continues, his idea, that's Maciunas's, was of a collective, doing festivals and publications. The basis of the collective was that the work had to be realistic and concrete. On both these grounds, it was implicitly opposed to the international style in music, the going thing in poetry, abstract expressionism in painting, and so on. There was no creed, no possibility of a Fluxus group, which would have driven every one of us away, nothing but the rostrum and the material. We were very excited about that, end quote. A year later, so we're now in 1965, an extract from Postface, a piece entitled An Extract from Postface, appeared in the German anthology Happenings, Fluxus, Pop Art, Nouveau Realism, edited by Wolf Ostel and Jürgen Becker. This extract, and I put that in quotes, was actually an extensively rewritten vituperative account laced with painful put-downs of Maciunas. It emphasized the role of Ostel, whom Maciunas considered to be not only in league with Higgins, but as publisher of the striking periodical Décollage that I showed you before, that included many Fluxus artists, even more of an arch rival in innovative graphic design. Expressing feelings he hadn't dared articulate in the English language, Higgins defiantly declared in German, "I now founded Something Else Press to publish the things that Fluxus should have done, and I will continue to do so." Also in the German text was an emphasis on Maciunas's and Flint's brand of pro-Soviet politics that had so alienated many of their colleagues earlier. Higgins's most damning words appear in the final paragraph. Referring to the aftermath of the politically charged picketing of Stockhausen, Higgins states, "Fluxus could not survive this blow. No one was interested anymore. Fluxus went out of existence, and somewhere a sad and not-so-young Maciunas is sitting in the same street, on the floor, patiently putting together the first edition of the Fluxus magazine and refusing to accept the demand that he resign." Once again, my own awareness came belatedly. In 1965, when I questioned Maciunas as to whether he wasn't being a bit harsh to accuse Higgins of such extreme disloyalty, and most colleagues were accusing George of total paranoia, George responded that the evidence was in Vostell's German book. I owned this book from the time of publication, but didn't speak German. So a supposed direct translation into that language of an essay titled An Excerpt from Postface didn't strike me as particularly incriminating. Only 20 years later, in researching something else, did I decide to have that text translated, at which time all the pieces fell in place. Even without all this volatility, it's easy to understand why Maciunas and Higgins would part ways. Fluxus editions and publications, like its performances, were emphatically amateur, as distinct from professional, in concept, even though Maciunas was an extraordinarily skilled and imaginative designer. Operating by the seat of his pants, he was thrifty and resourceful, emphasizing the otherness of his material. Typically, his labor-intensive frugality dictated design decisions, such as hand collation and the box format itself, which was one way to avoid standard bindings, the most expensive element in regular book publishing. His primitive marketing strategy was based on the assumption that the burgeoning worldwide and, of course, pre-internet social and postal network of Fluxus artists would promote his and their products. I showed you some labels before, but these are the actual boxes. They were cheaply made of plain plastic boxes, purchased on Canal Street, unorthodox materials found there or in any hardware store or on the street, paper so crude that some were more commonly intended for packing material rather than printing. Typewriter-type text and meticulously applied dry transfer lettered headlines. Maciunas considered his own fabrication efforts freely given and never factored his numerous long hours into the retail price. His main printer was Zachar Brothers, a firm whose primary source of income was pornography, which incidentally guaranteed that they would never apply censorship to Maciunas's controversial political opinions in his collaborations with Henry Flint. In my favorite variant of an oft-quoted public Fluxus manifesto, and this is from that issue of the Tulane Drama Review with the Fluxus foldout, Maciunas wrote, "Fluxus art, non-art, amusement forgoes distinction between art and non-art, forgoes artists' indispensability, exclusiveness, individuality, ambition, forgoes all pretension towards significance, rarity, inspiration, skill, complexity, profundity, greatness, institutional and commodity value. It strives for monostructural, non-theatrical, non-baroque, impersonal qualities of a simple, natural event, an object, a game, a puzzle, or a gag. It is a fusion of Spike Jones, gags, games, vaudeville, Cage, and Duchamp." While Maciunas was turning theory into quips, a more verbose, didactic Higgins was educating the masses through numerous essays in his newsletters. Intermedia, games of art, boredom, and danger are only a few of the pertinent modalities he defined and explained. His publishing manifesto decreed fullness of body and mind, quote, "an art that clucks and fills our guts," end quote. On the financial front, Something Else Press would have been inconceivable without his inherited wealth. From the beginning, he insisted on traditional accoutrements of quality, as outlined in the essay accompanying his first catalog, What to Look For in a Book Physically. Utilizing his previous job experience doing design and production for a commercial book manufacturer, Higgins made elaborate cost analyses that determined, for one example, that Ray Johnson's Paper Snake had to sell for exactly $3.47. He set up an office in New York's publishing district on Lower Fifth Avenue, advertised in the trade magazine Publishers Weekly, sent commissioned salesmen on the road, and directed his attention to libraries gearing both format and design to standards they would accept. An example of his reliance on the salesman's opinions is this book by Jackson McLough, Stanzas for Iris Lezak. The original design was this black and white dust jacket. When the salesman complained that the book wouldn't sell because of the jacket, Dick reprinted it in shocking pink, actually much brighter pink than what's shown here, with a bright orange wraparound band. Even when his competition with Maciunas led him to publish a boxed edition, in this case, Wolf Ostel's Décollage Happenings, he advertised it by emphasizing its sameness to a book. And he actually put the title on the what would be the spine, so you can see how it would fit on a bookshelf. And he was slyly getting in another dig at Maciunas when he said, "The whole package fits onto a bookshelf and in this way differs from most other odd format books." With the exception of Postface Jefferson's Birthday, he had all press publications professionally typeset. He used the finest printers and binders and materials, such as acid-free paper. "We are not interested in built-in obsolescence," he stated. "We want our books to be as fresh 10 years from now as they are today, and as much of a joy to behold." End quote. Indeed, it was in the areas of presentation and marketing that Higgins made one of his most profound contributions to small press history. An essay I wrote many years ago expressed my initial confusion about Higgins's practice and my ultimate understanding of its success. This is what I said. There's something called self-plagiarism today, so I have to tell you that I used this before. Bucking the trend towards eccentric multiples and boxed editions using unorthodox materials, Dick resolutely produced well-made book-like books, complete with cloth-covered boards and shiny dust jackets. They didn't look stodgy. In fact, the sometimes florid typefaces and garish graphic treatments leapt off the shelf, but I was baffled by the conformism. Dick was committed to the most radical art concept of the time, intermedia. He wrote the key essay defining it, yet he wouldn't tamper with the formalism of the book. Of course, he turned out to be right. By advertising where book dealers and librarians looked and offering them a package they could recognize, he snuck the avant-garde into the hands of a new readership. These artistic wolves in sheep's clothing infiltrated the establishment, laying the groundwork for the artist's book revolution to come. In its traditional book formatting, appeal to libraries and bookstores rather than galleries, and prophetic championing of the works of Gertrude Stein, an author whose work he republished extensively. Something Else Press revealed the most significant underlying philosophical divide between its own publishing program and the more visual, tactile, and participatory one of Fluxus. Even though he espoused and in his performance work practiced intermedia, which he referred to as the mid-ground between traditional media, Higgins in essence saw his press as a literary purveyor. This characteristic harks back to the very young Higgins of the late 1950s and early 60s, who, influenced by that era's small press revolution, began self-publishing his own writings. As he once expressed it, quote, naked and cranking out his works on an 1888 A.B. Dick mimeograph machine to the tune of The Ride of the Valkyries, end quote. I want to defend literature, he said in a 1972 issue of his newsletter. Literature is the art of thought. Call it the lowest common denominator or the highest acting principle. Without it, the other arts are trivial. These statements were made during one of the most prolific periods of Maciunas's production of Fluxus box multiples, a circumstance Higgins rightly or wrongly took some credit for. Now we have a third version of Postface, published as part of an anthology in 1982 and once again revised, but without a notation of that revision. He went to great pains to minimize any prior conflict between himself and Maciunas, even though he was unable to completely abandon his earlier competitive attitude. Quote, "There is no question that while it was not the intention, it was an effect that something else press's development led to a decrease of the necessity for Fluxus book format involvement in view of the fact that now many of the artists who founded Fluxus have something else as an alternative outlet," end quote. And actually, of course, Maciunas wasn't interested in publishing books as books. He always resisted the issue of binding, and he published things as posters sometimes. There's a whole other story there. But for all their stylistic and personal differences, Maciunas and Higgins both offered alternatives to a calcified establishment with one very central tenet they had in common: democratic distribution and pricing. Maciunas consistently produced his Fluxus multiples in theoretically unlimited quantities, limited solely by demand and the time it took for fabrication. With only a handful of exceptions, Higgins's Something Else Press editions were published in such large quantities that they remained in print at their original modest prices into the 1990s. Both entrepreneurs had adopted a strategy in which art didn't have to be validated by signature. This discordant history has a bittersweet ending. In 1974, the press went bankrupt, and Higgins wrote a long, rambling letter to Maciunas about returning to the fold. In 1975, Maciunas lost one eye in a beating by thugs, which precipitated within Fluxus a grand reconciliation led largely by Higgins that culminated in a banquet in Maciunas's honor in May 1976. And this is from the banquet. And actually, I didn't have access to an earlier photograph. I had mentioned the going away party for George in 1965, that it was at Takako's and how few people were there. And there is a Peter Moore photograph that shows that, and it's like very desolate. This is the way things ended up by great contrast. That the banquet in Maciunas' honor in 1976, an event held, incidentally, in the Loyal Zacher Brothers Fluxus and Pornography printing loft. That same year, Maciunas was forced to leave his Worcester Street home, which he didn't own, when the building was sold. He then moved to an old estate in New Marlborough, Massachusetts, near his good friend, the collector Gene Brown. There, although often in pain until his death in spring 1978, he welcomed visitors from around the world, gave numerous joyful parties, and hosted the 1977 Fluxus snow events, a glorious return to the heady, collaborative ambiance of early Fluxus. Thank you. Any questions? Yes? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
I have two questions. One is about distribution. Could you talk about where the books were distributed, where they sold in bookshops?
Yes, he sold them in bookshops, but actually he did a series called The Great Bear Pamphlets, and I think out in Berkeley or someplace they even were in the maybe James knows this. They weren't they in a like next to the checkout counter in a supermarket or something?
Yeah, that's what
Yeah. He went through the mostly it was the most conventional commercial outlets, and while it's obvious that a food store isn't conventional, it still was a place where you find things next to the checkout counter. I mean, it's a very commercial way of
Were they also distributed at readings or performances and maybe sent to other artists or poets?
Not necessarily. Dick was not always lugging around books. He depended on other people, the salesmen and the orders from the regular libraries, and stores. He was not lugging around books at all from place to place. And actually, there weren't as many performances then as there are now either. So, Philip, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about who was the audience for not only the performances, but all the Flux publications?
There was hardly any, Phil. This relates to what I was talking about, how the books, so many of the books remained in print, and there were large quantities of them. Except for a few, like, for example, Postface Jefferson's Birthday was only 1,200 copies, and he never reprinted it. And, there was the special edition of the Vastel and a few other things. Dick, when he published a book, and maybe he'd publish 1,000 copies, which was a huge amount for that kind of material in those days, right? And he's advertising in Publishers Weekly, and he's sending out dozens, maybe hundreds of copies to critics, probably all the newspapers, the conventional newspapers, and all the outlets where he might get publicity, okay? And then, of course, some orders are going to start to come in from, like, the libraries who aren't quite sure maybe what they're getting, and maybe you had some surprises in store. There was another newspaper that was published by a man named Jerome Agel, who was also the book packager for the McLuhan Quentin Fiore book, The Medium as the Massage. And Jerome had like a sort of an avant-garde publishing newspaper, and he was a big promoter of Dick's work and always had articles about the press books and his things. So these orders would come in, and that would mean that in the first 2 months after publication, Dick might have sold several hundred books, like 300, maybe 400. So he had 1,000, and he would go into the storeroom and he would say, "It looks like we need to reprint," because he was assuming that if it's 300 books the first month, it's going to be 300 books every month, which of course it wasn't. And so then he would publish another 1,000 or sometimes 2,000 copies of the books. I remember, I think Daniel Sperry's Anecdote Topography of Chance was several thousand. And then some books did sell very well, like the concrete poetry book that Emmett edited. They claimed there was something like 18,000 copies ultimately. It was not, Dick's operation was done on this professional, conventional level, not as we think of artists' books being done generally.
And Barbara, when he was up in West Glover, he had something else press office in Barton, and he had a warehouse there with one of these mechanical hoists. With the cases of books from here to there around in the warehouse.
It was
a
always
switchboard and a secretary and so forth.
He had everything.
Could you tell us who was the audience for the Flux publications? The Flux.
Well, George actually, these theoretically unlimited editions, most of them weren't published in very large quantities at all, simply because there was no demand. Dick sold more books because he pushed it so hard. George was depending on this peer-to-peer system, which worked up to a point. I once calculated, that Fluxus one that I showed you a picture of. This book. Now, George put that together by hand, obviously, and he usually wouldn't let someone else do it. And at one point, he was making maybe 10 copies a year. And he made it he kept going, because 5 years, 10 years later, he could still make you a copy if you ordered it. So even at the maximum of 10, 15 copies a year, and he made it for 14 years, go figure. And he was selling it at first, I think it was $10, then it was $20. And it was, hundreds of dollars worth of labor. But I have to say another thing, too, about the printing. While the quantity of printing that George did would be very expensive if he had paid for it, quite often he didn't pay for it. He ganged this stuff up on other jobs that were commercial jobs, like he was designing stuff for Anthology, the Cinematheque, what became Anthology Film Archives. And so he would have a large sheet of their printing that they were paying for, and without it costing them extra, there would be this 2-inch strip at the side. And in fact, I don't have a picture of it, but he made Peter a note paper. He called Peter up one day and he said, would you like to have some note paper? Of course, Peter said yes, that George was going to design this. So George designed these long strips with sprocket holes. They weren't holes, but they were black, like sprocket holes. And that was the note paper with Peter's. I think the holes themselves maybe were the letters. I don't know, but Peter's name is on there, whatever. And that was because he said, I have this job and I have this extra space. And so a lot of these odd sizes that he did came about because of that. And so it wasn't out of pocket for him. And there's somebody, can I give the other person a chance, Jeff, and I'll get back to you? Yes?
It says there in the flyer that you worked for both men, and I just wondered what kind of things you did for them, or with them.
Okay. Well, first of all, I was editor at Something Else Press for the first year and 3/4. I was the first editor there. And, of course, that it was sort of, we all did everything in a way. I mean, I did correspondence, and too, he didn't have a separate secretary at that point. For George, it was a little more nebulous, really. He called me the temporary administrative director and doing public relations. That was mostly when he was in Arizona. And it was sort of, I don't even remember much of what I did because it was somewhat of a spurious title. I had, technically I had responsibility, but there wasn't much to do without his presence. I mean, we collaborated on some editions later on and different things through the years. But in that period, I do remember that when people ordered Fluxus editions, I was the one who was the go-between. And I can't remember if maybe Io or someone had the key to George's loft and got me the stuff or whatever, but people would come to my apartment to pick it up, and the transaction would be handled through me. That was all there was to do when he wasn't there.
How did you happen to meet them in the first place?
Oh boy, for me it's a fabulous moment. But if you want to hear it, I met, because I still have the picture of meeting George the first time in 1961. That was when he had the AG Gallery on Madison Avenue, And I used to go, excuse me, I'm falling off the chair. I used to go to galleries very religiously, and at that time, the gallery district was north of 57th Street, mostly on Madison Avenue. So, I'd spend days going up and down, and I knew all the galleries, and, that was, New York was then and still is such a fabulous place to get self-educated about all this stuff. And so I'm walking by one day, and I see there's a gallery I hadn't noticed before, so it must have been late 1960 or early 1961. And it was this AG gallery, and I walked up this one flight of stairs, and just inside the front door, there was a table that had a lot of little graphic designed cards and flyer kinds of things. And at that time, I was very interested. I always have been interested in commercial graphic design, and I collected a lot of it. And I said to a man who was there, who was probably Almus Salsius, George's partner, I said, "Who did these?" And he pointed to the back of this loft-like space, and George was on a ladder, and the plaster had been stripped from the ceiling, and there were all these beams going across, horizontally across the space. And George had these large sheets of slightly stiff but translucent, sort of flexible paper, very large sheets, and he was putting them between the beams and making a vaulted ceiling out of paper. And I've never forgotten that. I can still see him on the ladder. And actually, I didn't get to know him at all then. In early 1962, but I got on his mailing list, which was the important thing. So, of course, I didn't know all what was going on, and he went off to Europe to do the European concerts and stuff. And in early 1962, Peter and I went to a concert at Cooper Union on avant-garde music. There was a series there. And Dick Higgins had gone to Yale with Peter's brother. So we introduced ourselves, and Lamont was in that concert. And so we got on their mailing lists. And then by that, we got all the notices and started going to the things. But really it wasn't until 1964 that those concerts, those Fluxus concerts were in New York. So I didn't see George between 61 and 64. Yes? And Jeff, I'm sorry. Okay, right after Michael. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say that when George was having his fight with Charlotte Moorman and so forth, I think Yoko and John were somehow in there too, and George wanted to communicate with people who had been involved in the Avant-Garde Festival. He used you as the intermediary. And if you wanted to reach,
Well, George knew he could trust me, and I. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. I was between these two people, and not realizing the depth of their animosity. Seeing it, George wasn't complaining specifically to me about it, and certainly not when I was doing something, with him or whatever. But, Dick held himself totally in check about that in my presence. He wouldn't have dared say anything in the office against George, And as I said, it was lucky that maybe it took so long for me to read how bad it had gotten. You missed, I think, part of the beginning where Postface had been rewritten in several times. I'll tell you later.
Is there any
relationship from Maciunas being in Europe and the Italian futurists?
Oh, it's much later. It's much later.
Well, did he see a connection? Or?
Oh, well, okay. First of all, we could put that in a time frame. And I had said how much George and Dick, with their international collections, had taught me and influenced me and whatever. The question of Dada and Futurism and how they were received in the United States. The Motherwell book on Dada was done, I think, in 1951. I did not see it at that time. I saw it much later, and I suspect that other people that we knew probably, knew Dada. People like Emmett were much more educated and in this area and had more of those European connections. So these terms were very vague to someone like me. And then the Futurists, really, there was a 1961 exhibition at MoMA, but it was mostly paintings and stuff. And Mike Kirby did a book on Futurist performance, which sort of woke us all up about that. But that was late 60s, I believe. So
Think about the manifesto. Much later. Well, the terrorism, the protests.
Well, no. What I'm saying is that I don't think we knew these terms, and some of us knew these movements, but I definitely wouldn't say that the terrorist part or that recent show on futurism at the Guggenheim exposed a lot of stuff we didn't get to see. I mean, because of the fascist connections and whatever, and this was always downplayed in the United States. So I certainly was not informed about it until much later, and I don't remember people discussing it. As I say, someone like Emmett Williams probably knew more about it, but I mean, Larry, yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed the early part, stuck in traffic, so I hope I haven't.
I'll give you a DVD.
I know repeat is something you've already talked about, but Bob Watts once told me that the Gutai show in 57, I believe, was a very deep influence upon
Yes.
and others.
And there was an article in the New York Times at that time, yes.
And I mean, Dada's often mentioned, and you mentioned the Michael Kirby book, which is, also in the futurist. So, but Gutai is not, certainly is celebrated, but it's not spoken about so much in connection with Fluxus. And there's so much with paper and so on. You mentioned the vaulted ceiling. Were you aware in your connections with George any particular appreciation he had about Gutai, given the strong Asian connection?
Well, yeah. I'm sure he knew about it, and Alan Capro was the one who was really promoting Gutai as an influence at that time. And Gutai has a whole section in his Happenings book that came out in the mid-'60s. But I don't remember George. I mean, I don't remember every conversation I had with George, obviously. And there must have been some awareness, because all those Japanese were figures in Fluxus. So, yeah. And of course, there was High Red Center, I can't answer. I just don't know. I mean, I would believe it would have to be known, and particularly because of Capro, too. So, did I miss somebody here? Michael, I'm sorry.
I've been trying to get this fact from other writings of yours that you've done about something else, but I haven't seen it. So maybe Miss Worms or this I have to ask.
Oh, you, Miss Worms? Oh, come on.
You talked about Dick sparing no expense to have the books be of a certain quality. So then, why did in the paper Snake, instead of reproducing things in full color, he made all of the artwork orange and...
No, but that's Dick's design, and I didn't get into that in detail. I did not like Dick's design. Okay, what Thomas Schmidt said, and I got along fabulously with Dick. I never would say that's terrible design, but I was very interested in design. That's how I got interested in what George was doing initially, and when I went to the press, I'm thinking every time, I had nothing to do with the design of the books. It was Dick's press. He could do what he wanted. I thought his designs were terrible. Now, in retrospect, even designs that aren't aesthetically pleasing or aesthetically what you'd want them to be or whatever, they have a certain look to them. And Dick had this very weird way of designing a book. And that was one of the prime examples. And it was Dick putting his mentality over and above Ray's to a certain extent, wasn't it? There were a lot of things about that book Ray didn't like. Am I correct?
He never says anything specifically about the design, but I thought that there must be
I thought I heard him say, well, way back when, about the design, but I don't know. I can't say more.
No, thank you for that. So it wasn't a financial consideration?
Oh, no, not at all. Although I guess it kept the price down to $3.47, but Mark, yeah?
And yeah, he was trying to keep the price down by using...
I can't hear you.
I say he was trying to keep the price down by using limited colors of inks, right? That's why it had that weird color.
I don't...
Anyway...
It may have had that result, but I never saw his design. Look, he went and reprinted that whole run of the dust jacket for the McLow book, I don't know.
What I wanted to ask was, I'm sorry if you might have mentioned this, was the connection between George and the Futurists in the form of those bolts that he used for the binding?
That has been a question in my mind for a zillion years, and I wish I had asked George about it when he was alive. There's this book by Fortunato Devereaux that is a bolted book, which you think of this as being a direct descendant. Now, there are two things about that. One is that book, I believe, is on the cover of the catalog or something related to that book, but the book itself does not appear in the checklist. The other thing is that show was at MoMA. I can't remember the exact relationship, but George was mostly in Europe then. George left for Europe November 1961 or sometime around then. And so I haven't looked at this problem in years, but it's always been on my mind. I am not sure George saw that book. And it's also the danger of seeing two things that look similar and inferring that one influenced the other when we know that these ideas are in the air sometimes. And that could have happened. I just can't say it. The indications are that George did not see that book in that show. I cannot swear to it. But.
Barbara, I just wanted to make one small correction about your last slide of the Festschrift banquet.
Yes.
And the idea was a George Brecht idea.
Yeah.
Okay, no. Actually, that's my language. I knew that, actually, and I know your involvement and Sarah's and everybody else's. The banquet wasn't Dick's doing. It was the initial reconciliation at an earlier point between, in other words, Dick did this complete turnaround starting in 1974, in which he was, what can I say, reconciling with Dick. And so it was the reconciliation he was very involved in. I could have worded it better. And no, I didn't mean it to sound as if the banquet had been his idea at all.
Dick and Allison were involved with it. I brought the idea.
But I'm talking about before the banquet, the after George's eye was lost. Dick he was talking differently about George.
Is the short bit
I'd just like to add that George did share Dick's letter, which I don't think is very nice,
Oh, the reconciliation.
I'm still one of those people who believe in privacy, which seems to be going away rather fast. But George was, I think, very, I don't know, gloating a little bit about that letter, and at least to a few people, let's say, on the inside of this circle, he shared this letter. But I mean, he didn't do it in a gloating way, but maybe proud or apply your own adjectives. But
well, I think he was also grateful. Yeah. And then when the banquet occurred, everybody's there were a lot of people who came back to him at that time, symbolically, I think,
I would like to establish the years of the end of the publication. So you said Maciunas went bankrupt.
No, Maciunas didn't go bankrupt. It was Something Else Press. Dick Something Else Press. He used up all his money, basically.
So his publication ended when?
that's just
When what was his last book publication?
Oh, golly. James Hoffman maybe knows. I don't remember the exact last book because actually he handed over the press to somebody else for a while, but then he withdrew all his money. And I think the year of the bankruptcy was 1974, maybe. The gardening book was the last, maybe. Yeah, I'm sure. I wasn't. I left the press very shortly before my first child was born in September 1966. So I think I left in August. Maybe I worked pretty close to the end, and but for years afterwards, I did proofreading and copy editing on a freelance basis for them. So, but I wasn't involved. I wasn't in the office or directly involved with it in any way. Yes, Larry.
I'm sorry to keep saying something, but I mean, this is so interesting and so deep and wide, and you're such a gold mine of information, it's hard not to take advantage. I just wanted to mention about Dick and the conventionality of the book. You know, you explained very well kind of what his motives were to kind of slip this, you know, lack of a better term, you know, avant-garde or whatever you might want to choose to call it, information under the doors of conventional libraries. But there was still, you know, some irony I saw, particularly in the book, which I can't pronounce, F-O-E,
F-O-E-W.
yeah, which was made to look like a Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that crosses the boundary of conventional and into the ironic objects.
But it's still a book.
Appropriation.
It is
I mean,
bound
it's still
exactly
conventional.
like a book.
Yes, but it is definitely.
Oh, yeah, I mean, he was
I mean,
unconventional.
complete
yeah.
with a little ribbon.
Yeah.
You know.
But of course, a library getting that, you know, they're seeing it described and it's a book and they're getting it and it still looks like a book. They can still put it on the shelf. You know? I mean, his designs were not conventional themselves.
I don't know. I think that book stands out for me as object-like because of its.
Well, it's,
reference.
yeah, it crosses
Yeah.
over.
I mean, but he did so much, and you know, Renaissance man kind of guy. You know. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.